Greetings! Today, I want to talk about what are the most important things in video games. These are my personal preferences, which I'll try to explain. So keep in mind that this is my personal opinion, which I'm sharing here, and not trying to impose at you. I would love to see your preferences in the comments. So, let's begin. I'm gonna reserve the number one spot for the very end of the video and start with the second most important thing in video games, which is the atmosphere. Now, this is a broad complex of elements which include the visual artistic style, the sound design, the voice acting, the overall mood of the game, etc. I can try to define the atmosphere as a certain way the game makes me feel. Dreamy, adventurous, relaxed, pumped up, or cozy. Each game has its own atmosphere, which I either vibe with or not. If the atmosphere and the mood of the game doesn't match my preferences, all the other elements instantly lose any value. The third place is kinda tricky to decide between, since I could argue that both of the things here are equally important. However, just for the sake of this video, I'm gonna put one over the other, and that would be the actual gameplay / mechanics, which is what you can do in the game and how you can do it. Some of you might say, isn't gameplay the most important thing? No, it is not. Since, as I've mentioned earlier, the game can have the most amazing gameplay possible, but if I don't vibe with the overall mood and the premise of the game, I'm not that interested. However, there are exclusions to this rule, since some games do base everything about them around gameplay, which becomes the main driver of everything else. At number 4, I've got story. And not just the story in general, but more importantly, the narrative part. A bit confusing, I know, let me explain. I don't care that much about what I'm being told in a game, rather than how it is being told. For me, an excellent example of that is The Witcher 3. The story of The Witcher 3 is not that engaging, without some serious plot twist or intrigue, and a pretty lackluster culmination. But the way it is presented to the player is everything. The dialogues, the chemistry between the characters, the bond you develop with the character, the presentation of events, the nonchalant chats, all of that for me is golden. And so good to a point where I don't really care about the pretty stale dark fantasy story that the game tries to unpack. Finally, at number 5, I've got graphics. And yeah, I'm not trying to be the contrarian edgelord in the miserable attempt to look like I'm so special and transcendent. I love nice graphics. I love realistic graphics. I love when you look at the game and be like, God damn! However, in the grand scheme of things, it is really not that important. What's more important is the artistic style of the game. A good example of that would be Bloodborne. From a purely graphical standpoint, Bloodborne visuals are not anything special. We've had games before it that were much more graphically advanced, but the artistic style of Bloodborne is second to none and will remain timeless basically forever. That being said, I tend to associate artistic style with the atmosphere of the game rather than how the game looks from a purely technical standpoint. Thus, graphics per se, for me, are not that important. And I've been reassured of that recently while diving into some classic games I've personally never played before, like the first 3 games in the Splinter Cell franchise. The majority of the past games don't age that well if we're talking about graphics, but their immaculate atmosphere, art style, gameplay, and story are usually so good and even refreshing that, while playing them for the first time in 2025, I simply forget that some of those are 15 or 20 years old. So, what's the number one, the most important thing in video games? I'm sure most of you have guessed it already, and it is the combination of all the previous stuff all together. Every element I've mentioned is important. However, they rarely, if ever, work separately. The best games that go down in history as classics almost always have a really good balance between the different aspects that make them. I would say that for a game to be decent, it has to nail at least two of the aforementioned elements. That was my list of the most important things in video games. Now, I would like to hear yours. What matters the most to you? What you can and cannot tolerate in video games? Let's discuss in the comments. Thanks for watching and see you next time.